We know from science that every 7 to 10 years, my body replaces virtually every single cell. I'm married. I've been married for over 10 years. But if physicalism is true, technically I've only been married for about maybe 3 years. Something just seems so off about it.
Eric
Eric
Hernandez.
The
Hernandez.
main man, Eric Hernandez.
The world's greatest living apologist.
You may have seen Eric debating popular atheists like Matt Dillahunty.
Does the existence of the soul prove that God exists? Eric Hernandez. Why is it important that we know whether or not the soul exists, and then also really understand what it is we're talking about when we say the soul?
Yeah, good question. So I'd say in a nutshell, first, it's always good to know truth. It's always good to know who we are, how God created us to be, and also because I would submit to you that if there is no soul, there is no resurrection. And so knowing what it is and what kind of things we are is going to inform us and give us a better picture of the nature of reality, the nature of our relationship with God, the nature of what human beings are at our core. And as we'll see, the existence and nature of the soul is going to have implications when it comes to moral issues or issues of what makes us different from just purely physical objects.
Got it. And if we don't assume God's existence first, does the existence of the soul prove that God exists?
It depends what you mean by proof, but I think it would definitely give evidence to it because if everything that exists is just physical and the only way we can explain our existence or anything is Darwinian evolution, then all you're going to have is physical matter rearranging itself into more physical, complex chunks of matter, but you're not going to get something like an immaterial soul squirting into existence. So it makes better sense that if there is a soul, then you would need you have these little contingent souls, if you will. It makes sense that there'd be a necessary first cause, ultimate grounding, ultimate soul like God in order to explain the existence of all these smaller contingent souls. And I say smaller
Yeah.
loosely, of course.
And why couldn't these contingent souls, like the smaller ones per se, why couldn't all of them just be necessary on their own?
I suppose it could be. I'd have to know why they would be, though. Could is just asking about a possibility, but possibilities are a dime a dozen. Unless I have a reason to believe that they are, I don't see why we should think. Also, given that I began to exist and I can't be necessary, so
Mm.
um, just the fact that I have a beginning would already show that I'm not a necessary being.
Got it. Okay, so going into that, what do you really define as the soul? What do you really say are its attributes when you're talking about like the soul existing?
Well, to define it, I would just say the soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body.
Got it. And so it possesses consciousness, so it's different than consciousness.
Uh, it's not reducible to consciousness. So, how tall are you?
I'm about 6 foot.
So you're 6 foot. Are you the same thing as 6 foot?
I'm not.
Right, but you possess the property of being 6 foot, or that attribute, so to speak. So, in that sense, I'd say it's the thing that possesses it. So, in other words, things are conscious, but thoughts have thinkers. So thoughts don't just float in the air around by themselves. It's going to be grounded or possessed by or owned by some a thinker. So, in the same way, if I know that I am conscious, then I would just ask, well, what kind of thing am I? What is the thing that possesses consciousness? And in that sense, we would say that the soul is a thing that possesses consciousness. So I am a soul. I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and I have a body.
And why would consciousness not be sufficient instead of why do we need to have a soul that has consciousness instead of just being a body that has consciousness?
Yeah, good question. So, you're not gonna when I say ground, we'll get to when I we get into the case for the soul. I don't know how a brain would have consciousness.
Hmm.
It's one of those things that where would you put it, so to speak? In other words, if I asked you, how many pounds does a number two weigh? What color is it? And how many can you fit in your pocket? The question doesn't make sense because numbers aren't located anywhere in that physical sense. Well, in the same way, I don't know what it would mean to say that my brain possesses consciousness. Where would it possess it at? Where would it put it, so to speak? And if consciousness is immaterial, as I'll argue, I don't see what the again where is it being grounded at in the brain if one is going to say that. It just seems to me to be a category fallacy at that point.
Got it. And is it possible that so? Oh, we'll actually get into this a little bit later. But in terms of the soul, also, we hear a lot of both the soul and the spirit in the Bible. What's the difference between those two?
Well, I'd say before we go there, let's get into what reasons do we have for believing.
Got it.
Just focusing just on the soul. Then I think that'll kind of help set a stage for answering those kind of questions.
Got it. Okay. So evidence for a soul. Where do you start?
Um, I would well first we can say this. Some people may say, "Well, how do we know?" Well, let's look at what science says. And to me, it's like you might as well ask what your landscaper says about about the soul. Why do I say that? Because, well, landscapers aren't necessarily the authority figures when it comes to metaphysical questions. Neither are scientists.
Hmm.
I don't know what that has to do. You might as well, you again, ask a dentist or a plumber. You know what they think about the soul. There's the question of the soul is something that science is impotent to answer, and it has let's just say any view you have on the soul, it's going to be what's called empirically equivalent, which means everyone's going to agree on all the scientific data, and so our disagreements are going to be philosophical, not scientific.
Hmm.
So there's no scientific data I'm going to disagree with someone who doesn't believe there's a soul,
Yeah.
because it's not about the science. Um, this would also be a category fallacy. Imagine if I told you there was an invisible man in my house, and you go investigate, and you're like, I don't see an invisible man, and I looked everywhere. I looked in the closet, looked in the bathroom, I never saw him.
Hmm.
Um, you can't argue, therefore, he doesn't exist if your reason for not believing is because you didn't see him. I would say, well, of course you didn't see him, he's invisible. So if the soul exists, it's immaterial. And science, I love science, it's a great tool for studying the physical material world. So why would I use something like science, which is limited to the physical, to try and investigate the non-physical? It's like trying to use your eyes to look for an invisible man. It's a wrong tool for the assessment. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at logic, look at philosophy, look at reason, and see. So when we say evidence, we would say, are there any reasons to believe that there is a soul?
So before that,
Yeah.
going on to the idea of like science can't actually understand or describe
Answer.
or answer the idea of whether or not the soul exists. That first assumes that it's not in the physical world. So how do we know that the soul isn't material? It is immaterial.
I'd say definitionally, um, just like we would know anything else by definition.
Got it.
By definition, the soul is something immaterial.
Got it. So we're not saying yet that science can determine like where consciousness or something comes from. It's just definition of a soul is non-scientific in its nature. So we
The
can't go to
definition of the soul
science.
is immaterial, and science can only study the physical.
Got it.
So you wouldn't use a metal detector to look for plastic.
Mhm.
Why not?
Because it's not metal.
Right. So I wouldn't use science to look for something immaterial because it's not material.
Got it. Okay. And so you were saying since science can't solve it, we look to philosophy. And where do we look to from there?
Not necessarily that because science can't solve it, we look at philosophy, but more so that why would I even try to use science in the first place? It's
Hmm.
not there's nothing special about science. I don't put it on a golden calf or pedestal as if it's the only way to gain knowledge about reality. Um, yeah, it's a great tool, but it's a tool that's limited to only studying one kind of a thing, things that are limited to the physical or things that are within the physical. And not everything in reality is limited to the physical. My morality, the question of morality, is not something limited to the physical. I can't look under a test tube or a microscope and see whether or not this murder that took place was wrong. It's not going to tell me in any of the blood analysis. That's not a material thing that I can look up. It's a metaphysical question that we would need the philosophy of ethics to kind of unpack and ask certain questions about. But again, all of which science would be impotent to answer.
Got it. So in terms of philosophy, science, just general critical thinking, stuff like that, what can we tell about the soul from what we know so far?
Well, I say here's the case I would make is because I mean so far we have to ask about, okay, well, what is it? What would we expect? And I would say the case is you really only have to make two basic points. The first point is that consciousness is not physical, and the second point is that I am more than a brain and body. I'm a soul. So let's just look at that first one. Consciousness is not physical. Um, since we're not using, or science is impotent, in other words, why even uh, nothing to use to investigate. I can't use an instrument, a physical instrument, to study the soul. We could say, so what is relevant? What's going to be especially relevant is what's called Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. But let's just call it Leibniz's law for short. And according to Leibniz's law, if some A and B are the same thing in philosophy, that literally means just identical, then whatever is true of one is true of the other. So, for example, Eric Hernandez, that's my name, and your guest. How many people am I talking about here?
The one person.
One person, and I'm using two labels.
Mhm.
So, Eric Hernandez is the same person as your guest. So, whatever's true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of your guest. That's Leibniz's law. And moreover, if I can find what this tells us, is also gives us a test that if in principle I can find something true of Eric Hernandez that is not true of your guest, well then maybe it's not the same person after all, and I just thought they were. So to illustrate this, what this tells us is, again, all we need to do is find one difference, because if they are identical, they're going to both share the same properties because they're the same thing. So suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled chemical X and the other is labeled water. Well, let's pretend chemical X has the label ripped off. So you ask yourself, are these the same substance? And you think, well, they're both clear. They both feel like they weigh about the same. They're both fluid. So you think, yes, they're the same substance. But then you turn over the bottle that has the label ripped off, and on the back it says caution flammable. What did you just learn?
That it's not water.
Yeah. How? Because already there's something different that they share in properties. That's Leibniz's law of identity, using it as a test for identity. With that in mind, if there is no soul, then something like physicalism would be true. That human beings are purely physical objects made of purely physical properties and parts.
Does that have to be the case, or can there be like a world where, let's say, God creates humans without a soul?
I'm not even sure what that would mean, quite frankly. But maybe rephrase your question.
Let's say God, like, do you think it's possible for God to create humans, let's say, perfectly as we are now in human society, but like our decision making capabilities and our ability to function, move, and stuff like that all works without an immaterial soul?
No,
Why not?
for the argument I'm about to give.
Got it.
But good question. So we'll go here. If so let's just grant this for second. If there is no soul, then physicalism would have to be true, which seems to be what you're asking, right? The
Mhm.
physicalism would be true, and so that would mean that if consciousness exists in this hypothetical world you're talking about, um, then it would have to be identical and or reducible to something physical, like the brain. So, if we apply Leibniz's law, this would mean that whatever's if the mind and brain are identical, then whatever's true of the mind must be true of the brain and vice versa, because they're the same thing, and we're talking about one thing using two different labels. But is that the case? No. And it's easy to show examples of this. So, take a state of my mind, like my thoughts and beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false. And we know that every time you have a thought, there is neurological firing in your brain. Now, if my thought can be true or false, then we ask, well, if it's the same thing as my brain, are these neurons firing true or false? Well, that doesn't even make sense. That's another category fallacy. It doesn't make sense to say the left hemisphere of my brain is firing true, but then these groups of neurons firing here, these are firing false. I don't even know what that would mean. So, what we just discovered is my thoughts can be true or false, which is a state of my mind, but no brain state of mine is true or false.
What would happen if neurons firing and like let's say the electrochemical signals in our brain? What if those were like a language per se that like was in our brain, and in the same way that I can write a language on a piece of paper and I can say Eric Hernandez is 20 feet tall. That that could be false. Could that not be the same thing as like a language in our brain through these neurochemicals?
Well, note that language assumes consciousness. So you're basically asking, could my consciousness be in my brain? But here's the thing: um, are scratchings on a piece of paper language?
I don't know.
What makes something a language?
Understanding, or maybe the people
There's an
understanding.
intention behind it,
Yeah.
right? Um, so what you're basically asking is, can we reduce language to ink markings on a piece of paper? I say no. In fact, it's just ink markings on a piece of paper, but the language comes from the intention behind the markings you make and my ability to understand the intentions behind the markings you're making on the paper.
Got it.
So if there were markings on a paper that no one ever read, it's not like there's a thinking thing on a paper, right? It's just a way of conveying something, but it's something pointing to consciousness. So with the brain, I don't even know what that would look like, but my point is, all you're asking is, can that consciousness be those markings on the piece of paper? But let's just call the piece of paper your brain. I don't think so. I'm not even sure what that would look like. But just sticking to Leibniz's law, thoughts can be true or false. Brain firings aren't true or false. So automatically, that's one difference. They can't be the same thing. But let's try another one. um, my my brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but my thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy thoughts, we're not going to need a neck brace when we're done here.
What would
You were
happen?
supposed to laugh at that right there. That was a joke.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I was just thinking about something else.
okay.
I was just thinking about the 3 pounds thing and this whole idea of like what would happen if, let's say, instead of like the brain being the actual consciousness and having to equate those two, what would happen if the like consciousness has actually the same properties? Let's say our experience has the same properties as the actual thing, I guess. But it's in either in a place like we can't measure it physically, or it's in a different place physically. Like like quantum entanglement. What would happen if, like, let's say consciousness is just like an entangled state of like a far off universe, far off like galaxy or something like that?
What reason do we have to think that?
Well, I don't know. I was just thinking because like if let's say we're saying that the soul is for sure immaterial. Like if we can maybe think of a way in which it was material, and a possibility for that, would that
Can I
maybe?
interject here? You're asking me, but what if we were supposed that the number two did have weight, had a color? How many would fit in your pocket? It's still a category fallacy to me. Unless I have a reason to think that's possible or how it could be possible, I would say I don't even know how to imagine such a thing.
Hmm.
Because again, it just is such a wide such a category fallacy to it. Um, Content entanglement we can actually get into. I'd say after the second point, because there might be some relevance in how the soul interacts with the body there.
Mm,
There may be some relevance. However, note though that it seems like you're still trying to, and I know you're just hypothetically asking the
yeah.
question, but note it seems you're still trying to place quote unquote consciousness somewhere physically.
Hmm.
I don't think it's anywhere physical. Um, just like I don't think the number two is anywhere physical. Um, yeah, I'll leave that there. You feel free to go where you want. And let me give you before you do. Here's the last example using Leibniz's law. Um, my brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana isn't 7 inches long.
Hmm.
And these are states and sensations of my mind. So the point is simply that if all the properties of my brain are physical and all the properties of my mind are not physical, well, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. So that's the first point. And from there, it naturally is okay, if we know that consciousness exists and we just establish it can't be physical, then we say, well, then what owns or grounds or possesses consciousness? And I can say, well, I'm conscious. And
Mhm.
then I naturally ask, well, what kind of thing am I?
Mm.
Then we get into the next step of the case, showing that I am more than a brain and body, that I'm a soul.
The last episode I did was actually with a YouTuber that somebody commented down below. So if you do the same thing, put down your favorite YouTuber in the comments. I'm going to look at their channel and see about getting them onto a future episode. And then you can subscribe to make sure you don't miss that YouTuber talking more about what you enjoy when that episode comes out on my channel.
So far, let's say what I've said is successful. Well, then now you're going to have to explain this immaterial thing that exists that we call consciousness. What is grounding it? Because, like I said, thoughts have thinkers. So, to kind of go a little bit more into that, when when properties show up in the world, they don't just float around, but they're grounded in something. And so, take the property of being red. When you get on the freeway and you drove here, you didn't try to avoid the property of redness. You tried to avoid objects that possess the property of being red, like a red car.
Mhm.
But it's not like redness was on the freeway that, I almost got hit by redness on the way here. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So the property of thinking, a thought doesn't just float around, so to speak. It's going to be grounded, possessor, owned by something, namely a thinker. So if we've established consciousness exists and it's not physical, then we must, and then if I know that I am conscious, then I must ask, what kind of thing am I? And then we're naturally now going into the what makes me different from my body. I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul.
Got it. And so now we have this idea of like the soul is connected to the body, it has to be somehow. And you were kind of talking about quantum entanglement a little bit, but how do we get from an immaterial substance connecting with a material substance in the first
Well,
place?
I think it's a separate question than whether or not we have reasons to believe the soul exists.
Got it.
So what we're just trying to establish right now is, does it exist? Do we have reasons to believe? Because um, after let's say, so I'm going to give three arguments. Let's say I just gave them. Then you can ask, okay, well, where's the connection? Pretend I say I don't know. That wouldn't affect any of the arguments I just gave.
Got it.
So that's what's called an epistemic question. It's a how do we know kind of question. And what I'm giving are ontological arguments, existence questions. And so, for example, let's say if I asked, hey, tell me every detail about the inner workings and mechanics of your car's engine.
Hmm.
And you say, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, there you go. Your car doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right? Wouldn't follow from that. So you can know something exists even if you don't know how it works of the
Hmm.
existence. But we can save that for potential talk after establishing, okay, do we have reason ontologically to think that I am a soul?
Got it. And in terms of maybe we don't know, but do you have any like suspicions or ideas
I
of
have
how?
like three answers I can give. I'm just saying let's first establish there is a soul, and then ask the epistemic questions of, okay, well, how do we know if it were? Let's say, okay, let's grant it. What? How does it interact with the body?
Got it. And so what else have we not gotten to with the idea of whether or not the soul exists?
The second point in my case for the soul. So the first point is consciousness isn't physical.
Got it.
Second point is I am more than a brain and body. I'm a soul.
Got it.
So now I have to justify that with arguments.
Okay. So how do we know that we're not just a brain and body and we are a soul?
There's lots of ways, but I'll give three relatively short arguments. So first one is going to be an argument from um, identity through change and part replacement. So here's some more terminology to unpack first. If physicalism were true, then human beings would be what philosophers call mereological aggregates. And let's just say aggregate. What does that mean? It's a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So, for example, cars, watches, and Lego bricks are what we would call aggregates. They're a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. And the thing about aggregates is that their existence and identity, what they are, depends on the parts and the structure of their part. Depends on the parts and structure and arrangements of how they're put together. In other words, take a tricycle. How many wheels does a tricycle have?
3.
Right. If I remove a tricycle, then we could say, in a metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. And so, what we see here, what this tells us, is that again, the existence and identity of an aggregate is dependent on the parts and its structure. And two, it tells us that aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So, with this in mind, here's the argument. Premise one: I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise two: if I am a purely physical object, I do not maintain identity through change or part replacement.
Mm.
4, but I do maintain identity through change or part replacement. 5, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I'm a soul. Now, what reasons do we have to think that? I'll give you a short argument uh, um, from an atheist philosopher, late atheist philosopher, Jaegwon Kim. But we know from science that every 7 to 10 years, I get my body replaces virtually every single cell. So every 7 to 10 years, I virtually get a brand new body. Now, here's what Jaegwon Kim, atheist philosopher, said once. He said, in 2001, this brain and body, the one that I have now, did not exist in 2001. But guess what? I existed in 2001. Therefore, I'm not identical or reducible to that brain and body. Otherwise, I'd literally be a different person. Or think of this. Suppose I committed a crime 7 or 10 years ago, but they just now found the evidence, and J. Warner Wallace comes to my door, knocks, and says, hey, Eric, we got to take you in. We just found the evidence. Could I say, Jay, come on, that was 7 to 10 years ago. And we're just purely physical objects. So, quite frankly, you're not even looking for me. It wasn't me. It was another whole group of cells and structure. Go find them, but good luck, they don't exist.
Just a clump of cells.
Right. Yeah. He's going to throw the cuffs on me, rightly so, because why? We all know intuitively that we maintain identity through change or part replacement. Hence, I'm not identical or reducible to a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul.
So, with this idea of like we maintain identity, is it possible? Like, how do we know that we just don't just have the illusion within ourselves that we maintain identity because of like memory per se? How come? How like is it possible that it's just like we think we maintained identity in the same way that like let's say we could put all of the memories of let's say we made you a new body and put like I don't know if this is possible, but we put all the memories you have now into a new body. Most of us would probably say you haven't maintained identity there. But how do we know that it's not just an illusion, this maintaining of identity?
Well, one. So if we're just asking possibilities, like I said earlier, those are dime a dozen. Is it possible that what you just said about being possible is not possible? Sure, right. So I would just go back and say, well, what reasons do we have for believing that? In other words, sure, I could say almost anything is possible, but do we have a reason to believe that? And what is most rational to conclude? And if it's most rational to conclude, because remember, what I'm giving is not just a possibility, but an argument that if I were purely physical, then I'm not maintaining identity through change, but I do. Now your question is, well, what if we don't? I say, cool. Why wouldn't we?
So why would it be more rational that let's say we just have a flat playing field per se, and we have two opportunities. We don't maintain identity and it is an illusion, or we do maintain identity and it's not an illusion.
Because it seems to be intuitive to us. It seems to be a properly basic belief that I maintain identity through change. I don't see why. I would need an argument as to why we don't. And it seems like any argument that we don't is going to beg the question of physicalism, or you're going to have to set a standard. So this goes into basically what's called thesisship. Um, so let's start with that actually. And I usually give this before going into the argument, but let's go ahead and bring it now because it might be relevant. If you were to change the tires of a car, is it still the same car?
Yes.
Okay. I disagree, but I want you to hold on to that thought and keep that going. Now, suppose I change every single nut and bolt on this car. Is it the same car?
Just the nuts and the bolts.
No, every single. Oh,
Eh,
fair enough. Everything up to the nuts and bolts, right?
okay.
Windshield, bumper, everything. But before you answer that, suppose I took the replaced parts and then put those together. Now I have two cars. Then we can ask which of these two is the original, if any. And regardless of your answer, I think we can all agree that they both cannot be the original car.
Mhm.
Now, what that just showed us again is purely physical objects do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So again, if I'm a purely physical object, I don't maintain identity through change. Now, let's just say the physicalist wants to bite the bullet and says, "Yeah, we don't maintain identity through change." Okay, so every time I cut my hair, cut my nails, every 7 to 10 years. So I'm married. I've been married for uh, over 10 years, almost 11 years. But if physicalism is true, technically I've only been married for about maybe 3 years.
Yeah.
And there was some other guy married to some other woman for 7 years. And I'm gonna go find that guy. S- Now, why do you laugh?
Because you can't
Because
find him.
intuitively, it's like right that, and intuitively, it's like it just sounds bizarre. It's so something just seems so off about it that the average non-insane person that hasn't been influenced by physicalism sees. Yeah, there's just that can't be the case unless I'm given a reason to think that's the case, and it becomes such an absurd view, and there's such other absurd implications it has, such as again, okay, and some people want to say memory. They'll say, okay, well, it's not the physical body; it's the memory that maintains identity through change. Well, if I get in a car wreck, um, or on my when I fly home, tomorrow, and let's say the plane crashes, uh, but I survive, and when I wake up from my coma, I've lost my memory. Am I now a single bachelor? Because if my memory is what grounds my identity,
Mm,
well, that's not me anymore. That guy died in the plane crash.
mm.
Now, I once had a person who said there's no soul. Said, "Yeah, you're a new person." I'm like, "Oh, so I'm single now?" They're like, "Yeah, okay." Let's say I remarry, but then 5 days after I get married, all my memories come back. Now, did previous Eric come back into existence and the other guy cease to exist? Or is this now a third new person, whereas Eric, some new guy, now Eric part two? Like, I mean, the implications become very bizarre and absurd. And some people might say, well, yeah, well, that's just the way it is. Yeah, I would need to have a reason why that is, not just someone saying it's possible that's the case. I need to give it, hear an argument and see some evidence as to why that actually is the case.
Got it. So would you kind of say that us maintaining identity is pretty similar to Max and I were actually having this conversation, I think yesterday. This
Is he
idea,
here,
huh?
Max? Just
The
kidding.
guy sitting behind the camera.
There's no one behind the camera.
No,
Yes.
nobody behind the camera. It's an imaginary friend. He's invisible. We were trying to find him, but couldn't find him in the
That's
closet.
right.
And so we were talking this idea about like you can't really deny it. It's similar to like our like inputs that we get from our senses, our sensory input. Like we would kind of equate that. Would you kind of equate like maintained identity with sensory input to the same extent that like you can't really say that like your visual input is wrong because like you can't really act as if it's totally wrong all the time.
Rephrase that. I'm not sure what you're asking.
So would you say that just because we always act if it's the case, like everybody seems to pretty much universally accept like day to day that their identity continues. Would and in the same way that our sight, our hearing, our taste, all that, everybody seems to act that is a truth, like that those give
But
us
there's
accurate representations of reality. Would you kind of equate those to say
Sure.
like
If basically it's a question of it's the question of is there an external world? I say yes. If someone says, "Well, isn't it possible we could be in the Matrix?" I say, "Sure, but what reason do I have for believing that we are in the Matrix?"
mm,
Again, possibilities are like I was going to say something inappropriate. Possibilities are like farts. I'll be less appropriate. Everybody has one, and some smell worse than others, right? So, yeah. I, is it possible there's no physical external world? Sure. I just have no reason to believe that there is that my intuition and the way things present themselves to me in a self-presenting way, it's properly basic. Um, I have no reason to believe there isn't an external world, and everything points to the fact that there is. So, yeah, I would say it's in that sense. If that's how you're talking, absolutely.
Got it. Okay. And so are those are the full arguments for like grounding the soul in like reality, like
So
saying
I've
the
only
soul
given
exists.
one so far for the. So remember, it's a two-step case.
Okay.
If you're going to give a case for the soul, I would say you only need to defend two basic points. Consciousness is not physical,
Got it.
and two, I'm more than a brain and body.
Mhm.
So and then for that second one, I have three arguments that I typically give. Though there's more than three in general, but so that's the first one is identity through change. The second is the argument from what's called the indivisibility of personhood. And here's what that means. We'll start with the argument. Premise one, same starting premise. I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise two, if I am a purely physical object, then sorry. Premise one, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise two, purely physical objects can exist in percentages or degrees. Let's pause here. In philosophy, we can make the distinction, philosophers make the distinction of what are called degreed and non-degreed properties. What does that mean? So, take the property of being loud or hard. These are what our philosophers call degreed properties. They can fluctuate and change and exist in various percentages or degrees. So, something that is loud can be louder or quieter, and something that is hard can be harder or softer, right? They can fluctuate and change. Contrast this with a non-degreed property. Take the property of being even. So, evenness. The number 2 and number 6 are both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2. Why? Because non-degreed properties are all or nothing kind of things. They either are or they aren't, and there is no in between. So, now, with that in mind, degreed and non-degreed properties, let's ask this of persons. Personhood. Is being a person a degreed or non-degreed property? Well, going back to the argument, premise one, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Two, if I'm a purely physical object, then all exists in percentages or degrees. Now, if God forbid you were to sever my limbs, note it would make sense to say I have half a body, but would it make sense to also say and therefore I am half a person?
No.
No. Now, what did that just show us? That I am not identical to my body. In other words, think of it this way. Does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more?
No. No.
Right. Men are typically larger than women. And if we apply value to being persons, are men more valuable than women? Of course not. So what does this tell us? We're not identical or reducible to our bodies. Hence, I cannot exist in percentages or degrees. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I'm a soul.
Got it. And so all physical objects and physical things, I guess, are have only degreed properties.
Say that again.
So do all physical objects? Is it not possible for physical objects to have non-degreed properties?
Sure. But my point here is simply the question of whether or not personhood is a degreed property. So it makes sense to grab a table, let's say, cut it in half, burn half the table, and we could say there is 50% of a table.
Hmm.
And that makes sense. We can say that of physical objects, they can exist in percentages. My body can exist as 50%, but me as a person, I cannot exist as 50%. So whether I'm an embryo in development, a human person in development, an adult, or where I am now, note the amount of mass and matter doesn't change my value or the kind of thing or the nature of what I am. I'm still a human person. And thus, I'm not identical or reducible to a brain and body.
Got it. Okay. And so we have those two arguments, and so what is our third argument?
The argument from free will.
Got it.
What is free will? I would define it essentially as I am the first mover of my will or action. So if I raise my hand and nothing caused me to do that, I had free will. I was the first mover of that action. But if you tased my arm or my side and it caused my arm to go up, I didn't have free will. Okay. Premise one, either you're a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise two, if I'm a purely physical object, I don't have free will. Premise three, I do have free will. Four, therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, I'd have to obviously defend the premise I do have free will. Going back to the notion of being a first mover. Aristotle put it this way. He said, if I move a rock with my staff, then I can say that the staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he asks himself, what moved me? Now let's switch analogies for a second. Setting Aristotle aside, here's why it's important to find the first mover in a chain of events whenever we want to talk about moral praise or blame. Suppose you walk into a crime scene and the murder weapon was a gun. We see the person when he was shot in the heart. What was the thing that literally penetrated the heart?
The bullet?
Do we blame the bullet?
No,
Why not?
because the bullet didn't move it. The bullet didn't have the agency.
Right. Bullet didn't move on its own. It was moved by something else. So we go next to the next link in the chain. Now we look at the gun. Do we blame the gun? Well, it depends who you vote for. But I'd say no, we don't blame the gun. Why? Because we know that the gun didn't fire on its own, but was caused to fire by something else. Well, then we go one more link in the chain, and we see there's a person pulling the trigger. Now, why do we stop there? Because we assume they're the first mover in this causal chain of events. So note, if you want to find praise or blame, morally speaking, you look for the first mover. Now, let's go back to Aristotle's question. But what moved me? Now, if a person is going to have free will, specifically what's called libertarian free will, they have to be the first mover. Well, if I am a soul that transcends the physical world, then I am the thing that moves my body. Nothing is moving me. But if we're purely physical objects, then you can just think of dominoes falling in a row. So let's just assume physicalism is true. Because note how my argument would have to assume that there is free will. And let's say someone says, well, I don't believe there is free will, though. So I don't need to, go with your argument. Well, here's going to be the problem with that. And the reason I say we do think we have free will is because we're morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. This is why we punish criminals who shoot the gun. They're the first mover. But let's look at the physicalist view. They say, I don't think we have free will. In this analogy in this illustration that Aristotle is asking, what moved me? If there's no God and there's no soul, then there's something known as a law of causal closure that would have to be true. And according to the law of causal closure, every physical event must have a prior physical cause. So, anytime we have a physical event, we're going to have to ask, what was the physical cause of that physical event? So, let's suppose, though, a physicalist did want to preserve free will. And what they could say is, well, a group of neurons firing in my brain caused my hand to move, that caused a staff to move, that caused a rock to move. In this example, I'm the first mover. It was my brain firings that made this move. So look, I could still have free will, even if there's no soul. I said, well, time out. What kind of event is a brain firing?
Physical.
So what would we need?
Physical cause.
Yes. So they've just pushed back the goalposts.
Mhm.
So now what do we ask? Okay, well, what caused that group of neurons firing to fire? And they can say, well, another group of neuron firings fired. What happened? They just did it again. So note at some point, it's going to become obvious that this is simply going to lead to an infinite regress and the rock is never going to move. But clearly it did, so let's scratch that option. We can't have an infinite regress. The only other option they have at this point is to simply say that at some point, however many groups of sets of neurons firing that we want to give them, at some point, something external and prior to ourselves caused those group of neurons to firing, those group of neurons to fire that cause the hand to move, the rock, the staff, the rock. But note, once you point to something external and prior to yourself, you're no longer the first mover, and hence no longer do you have free will. So if I am a purely physical object, I do not have free will. But I do have free will, therefore I'm not a purely physical object. Now let's get back to the atheist or non-believer or physicalist who says, well, I don't believe we have free will. Well, if that's the case, you're going to have to give up two things. One, moral responsibility, and two, intellectual integrity. Uh, put it this way. I was at a friend of mine invited me to a company Christmas party one time. So it's a company Christmas friendly party environment, and as I'm talking with some other people, this one guy's like, "Oh, how do you know so and so?" And okay, cool. And, and yeah, I met through church. Yeah, I used to be a Christian, and then I started studying, and then I became an atheist. So I'm like, "Oh, and how is that? Why is that?" He basically said this. He's like, "Well, as I began to learn more about human beings, I learned that one is that like religion is a cause of a lot of evil or suffering or terror. 9/11. You look at 9/11. You look at the way they treat certain people to love who they want to love, women's rights, yada yada yada." And he said, and then I started studying like the nature of free will, and I began to realize we really don't even have the free will to believe in God in the first place. It's more of a byproduct of where you're born, how you're raised, yada yada yada. And they've even studied people's brain patterns who are religious, and they're pretty much all the same. And shameless plug.
Oh, all right. Hopefully, I edited that out. That thing fell.
See what happens. So, shameless plug. I'm going to take what I call the lazy approach, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers. And here's what I mean here by this approach. I said, okay, before I respond here, I said, let me see if I understand you correctly. You're telling me it seems like there were two factors that led you away from Christianity. One is that religious people do evil things, harmful things. He's like, yes. And two, that we don't have free will in the first place to even believe in God or not believe in God or whatever. He said, yes. I said, okay. Can I ask you a few questions? He's like, yeah. Usually Christians get mad at me at this point. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Here's my first question. It seems like you are trying to hold these religious people morally accountable for what they're doing, like 9/11. But if what you believe is true and your worldview is true, these people had no other decision to make other than to do what they did, and they didn't even do so freely. So they did the quote unquote evil and suffering that they did, but we can't hold them morally responsible. They were just determined to do this and they couldn't do anything else or they couldn't do otherwise. So why are you trying to blame them for something they couldn't, that they were determined to do? You're holding them morally responsible, and yet they can't be morally responsible if they weren't the first mover. His eyebrows went up, and he says, I don't know. I've never thought about that. I said, no worries. I want to keep it friendly, Christmas party environment. I said, no worry. Just think of it, and maybe you can share your thoughts with me later. He's like, okay. I said, here's my next question. You seem to assume that your atheism is a byproduct of this intellectual integrity. You studied the evidence, you looked, you did the research, and you came to what appeared to you to be the most logical conclusion that atheism is true. But this seems to assume that you had the freedom to do the research, freedom to investigate, and then the freedom to change your mind in the first place. But again, if there's no free will, I can't help but ask, did you freely come to the belief that there is no free will? Which is obviously self-defeating if you were to say yes, and if he says no, well then why should I believe you? So note that if the non-believer wants to hold religious people morally accountable for what they do, and wants to take a sense of intellectual integrity or rational responsibility for their beliefs that there is no God, well then guess what they must assume exists? Free will. And if there is free will, then they're not purely physical objects. Therefore, I am a soul, or they are souls.
And so we have this idea that well, at least one of the premises is that free will can only exist in, let's say, in non-physical objects or something. Um, and I've heard this argument. So like, uh,
I would say free will can only exist if you are the first mover, and if there's no God and atheism is true, then given the law of causal closure, every physical thing is not going to be a first mover. It's going to be moved by something else.
got it. And I've heard this argument that that the way we make our decisions, even if it is immaterial, like our the deciding agent per se is immaterial, that it's not. It still has a like a pre-caused cause. It's this whole idea of like you only really do actions that you want to do. So like
Compatibilism
uh
is the name
sure.
for it. Yeah.
And it's like if you only do what you want to do, then who determined what you want to do? And if you determine what you want to do, then who determined you determining what you want to do? And it kind of has that continuous chain
Infinite
in the
regress.
back, infinite regress. Yeah. How does the immaterial soul still have free will? How does this infinite chain, infinite regression not happen even with an immaterial soul?
So what you're alluding to is what's called compatibilism, which is also called self-determinism. It's a view that you are determined to do what you do, but it's still compatible with freedom because you're determined to do what you want to do.
Hmm.
Whatever you're determined to do, you want to do whatever it is you're going to be determined to do anyways. In other words, sure, I'm determined to, let's say, um, eat Taco Bell, but hey, guess what, Eric? You want to eat it anyway, so what does it matter if you're determined? You're just doing what you want to do. And the compatibilist will typically say something like, your greatest desire is what is the thing that is causing you to do what you do.
Mm.
And so you are caused by something, but it's your desire, and so maybe you can still be the first mover, or it's at least originating somehow within you. But as you're pointing out, but wait a minute, that desire was caused by something external to me. Now, how would a immaterial soul avoid being determined there? Well, it wouldn't in that case, because in that case you're already conceding that immaterial things exist, like desires. On top of that, in this case, you have something like theological determinism, like Calvinists,
Mm.
and they would hold to that kind of compatibilistic view. And what's basically going to have to happen there is you'd have to ask the question, where did I get my desires? And who's going to be the first mover in this chain? It's going to be God. I think that is deeply problematic because I sin. Believe it or not, I've sinned once or twice in my life. And if compatibilism is true, I sinned because it's what I wanted to, but I wanted to because it was my greatest desire, and it was my greatest desire because, and you keep going back at the end of the chain, and who do you find at the beginning? God.
Mm.
So just like the guy shooting the gun was responsible for the murder in this scenario, God was the quote unquote one pulling the trigger, is responsible for my sin. I think that is deeply problematic and unbiblical, so I wouldn't go there. I'm not a Calvinist, let's just say. So an immaterial in and of itself doesn't avoid it, because if you concede the immaterial, but then you have an immaterial God being part of the cultural chain, well, then you still have determinism.
Hmm.
The point of the argument is that in order for this to even be possible in principle, in other words, on physicalism, it's not even possible. On dualism, what we're talking about, I am a soul with a body. It's at least possible in principle to have free will, and that's the argument.
So how is it possible to have free will if it seems like we only do what we want to do?
Says who?
Um, so are you just saying we don't actually only do what we want to do?
I'm saying I'm the first mover of my will.
And would that be you are the first mover of your desire too?
No, not always.
Got it. Um,
But you would have to assume my desire causes my action. I could agree with you and say I always do what I desire,
mhm.
but know how that's irrelevant to whether or not I'm the first mover of that, whatever I'm doing.
But if your desire determines your action, then whether or not you're moving first, does that really matter if you're the one
If you
doing it?
but if you're telling me my desire determines my action, then I'm not a first mover.
Got it. So you're saying desire does not determine your action.
Right.
Got it.
I
Okay.
do. Yeah, I'm saying I determine my action.
Got it. Okay. And that was what that was all of the arguments for soul's existence, correct?
All the ones that I
Yeah, we have
you
time
shared
for.
her
Yeah.
right now, yeah.
Okay, and we've been hinting at this for a little while. And in terms of connection with the soul and the brain, soul and the body, what are your ideas on that? Do you have any like stronger opinions on this than others?
Yeah, so one, even if I said, to reiterate, even if I said I don't know, I'm giving ontological arguments for the soul's existence. The question is an epistemic one about how it works. And I go back to, just because you don't know how your car works doesn't mean therefore your car doesn't exist. Um, However, a few things. One, it could be that, first of all, the question is assuming some intermediate mechanism. So if I said, how does A interact with B?
Mm.
I could say, well, by some mechanism C. But then what could I ask? Well, how does A interact with C to interact with B? Well, by some mechanism D in between both, right? Then you get to an infinite regress. So it could just be what's called a properly basic move. It's primitive in the sense that there is no intermediate intermediate mechanism. It's just an A to B direct correlation. Like it just is. We can go with that answer.
Mhm.
My soul just moves my body, just directly. If you ask me how did I get my car to turn on, I put the key in the engine and turned. Now, could I go deeper? Sure, but let's pretend if it's just the key turns, car turns on. There's nothing deeper to go into. At some point, you're gonna have to reach a bedrock where you're just gonna say A directly causes B. I'm fine with that. Or we can go with two, because some people argue, well, energy can't be created or destroyed. If the soul existed, it would have to create more energy or new energy. Well, the energy can't be created or destroyed is really an argument that assumes the law of causal closure. I'm not the law of causal closure. It assumes that the universe is a closed system. But if the universe is not a closed system and God exists and He can intervene, and if my body's not a closed system and I have a soul that can interject, well, there's no problem. So the thought that the universe or everything in the universe is a closed system is really more of an assumption or a rule of thumb scientists may use whenever they're studying something. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is true, nor is it necessarily true because, again, if God exists, then it's not a closed system. If I have a soul, my body's not a closed system. So, not a problem. Now, people may say, but okay, then why can't we detect the energy then? Where's the energy that the soul creates? And that's assuming we're going to go with this second answer. Moreland said something interesting, JP Moreland. Imagine the Hoover Dam. How much water is in that dam? A damn lot of water, right? There's a dam, and it's a lot of water.
Nice.
Thank you. Now imagine there was just one switch I could flip that would release all the water in the Hoover Dam. How much energy do you think would be released by all the water if I were to open the gates of the Hoover Dam? How much energy do you think that would be? Quite a bit,
Yeah.
right? Now compare that to the energy of me flipping a switch. What's the comparison?
Very small.
Crazy. Now imagine that as soon as I flip the switch, the energy of the dam is released simultaneously. The energy of me flipping the switch is, no pun intended, drowned out by the energy of the water being released. That could be the case too. It could be that the energy released by the soul in order to create the rest of the movement of the body is so minute in comparison, it gets drowned out, and there'd probably be no way to detect it. Or something somewhat more recently, someone proposed that maybe there's something like quantum entanglement going on. In quantum entanglement, you have these particles that are entangled, and there's so much distance between them that there's no way there can be there's no way that there can be like a uh, uh help me explain it. The
Uh,
You affect one, it affects
causing.
the other.
Yeah, so causation can actually happen. So quantum entanglement pretty much happens instantaneously. So like
Right.
two different particles can affect each other instantaneously. That shouldn't, like, from our understanding of physics, that shouldn't be able to be the case, because causation, as far as we can tell, can only happen at the speed of light, which is not instantaneous.
And they're so far apart, there doesn't seem to be any kind of so they're entangled. Whatever
Yeah.
happens to one is going to be affected by the other.
Yeah.
So that could be the case. It could be that my soul just doing something is entangled with my body, that just like in quantum entanglement, my soul doing something make causes a reaction in my body, and they're just quantumly entangled in that way. That seems plausible to me as well. So we've got 3 or 4 options on the table. I'd say, pick whichever one you want, and let's high five and say there's a soul.
Yeah, I like this idea that it's like so much stuff going on in our brains that, like, let's say like one small thing were changed or a couple of small things were changed, we wouldn't be able to detect that. But I and also this idea that, like, oh, we have like conservation of momentum, conservation of energy. So like you can't introduce more momentum, you can't introduce more energy into a system. Like everything within a physical system just stays the same. But the thing is, we've only observed that with other things. And like, let's say if we were to like measure the brain and like see like all the electrical signals and they did exactly what we thought they were going to, like, we, I don't know, somehow measured that, I would probably say, like, if we were able to get everything down specifically and they did exactly what we thought that they would be, then that would probably rule out the existence of something external affecting it. But I don't think we have that capability to measure that. And also, we don't necessarily have to introduce more energy, because maybe you'd have to change momentum. But if you, let's say, I was talking about this a couple days ago, where it's like, let's say we have like energy. Well, let's do force. Let's say we have like 5 newtons of force going this way, and then instead of like, it would take extra energy to go 5 newtons of force the other way. It would take extra energy. But if we did like 4 newtons of force the other way, or whatever the math ends up being, that's not introducing more energy. It is introducing different momentum, which technically
You add a curve to the roller
Yes.
coaster.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So not introducing more energy, but technically is changing momentum. So it gets around the energy idea. But I do like that idea. And where were we? This idea of like the brain affecting the soul affecting the brain. How does this relate to, like, we were also talking about energy? Not sorry. Identity earlier, and identity and memory. How does like the soul and the brain and memory? How does that all fit together in your idea?
The memory, my soul, think of it like the Wi-Fi signal and router, and someone screws with the Wi-Fi router. It's going to affect my Wi-Fi
Got it. Got
in
it.
a nutshell.
Got it. Okay. So it's been an hour. I have more stuff. If you want to keep going, we can stop it around here if you want, and just kind of do an ending.
How many more questions do you have?
I have a bunch of random things. I can we can do like a quick
Rapid fire.
a rapid fire.
Yeah, $5
Okay.
a question, rapid fire.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna go for some rapid fire because we are out of time. And first one. So if we are either a body or a soul, and we
False. I'm sure.
if we are either a body or a soul, do ourselves, or do we have an actual like gender? Like does the
Yes.
soul have a gender?
Yes.
Got it. And is the soul eternal?
Not by nature. God would have to preserve it.
Got it. And
And I can expand all these if you want. We don't have to go that rapid fire.
okay.
So the body is an external expression, if you will, of my soul. And all things being equal, obviously there's abnormalities and defects and mutations. But if let's say that this, I got a blanket. Think of the blanket like the body. Think of this chair as being analogous to the soul. If I put a blanket on top of this chair, you won't see the chair, but you see the shape the blanket takes, and it gives you an idea of what's under the blanket. I'd say analogously, the body is like that to the soul. So if that's the case, then yeah, the soul would have a gender.
Interesting. I like that. And then in terms of
And so note too, before you go on,
yes.
this actually would remove the possibility of transgenderism.
Mm.
Because some people complain as if it's a slippery slope, like, oh well, that opens the door to transgenderism. Not on my view of the soul. I hold to a traducing view of the soul, what's called organicism. We won't go deeply into that, but let's just say it's related to all of this,
Yeah.
in that my body is a reflection of my soul. So what kind of soul do I have? I just have to look at my body.
Mm.
That tells me what kind of soul I am. So on that view, I cannot have a body different than the kind of soul I have,
Mhm.
because by default, my body expresses my soul.
Yeah.
So that removes literally even just the possibility of being in the quote unquote wrong body.
And it is original body, so like if you like introduce new stuff and like
Sure.
that doesn't make your soul
Right.
into a different gender if you
Right.
introduce new genitalia or something.
Right.
And then in terms of like eternal, the soul being eternal, you said God has to like
Not by
sustain it.
nature, right? God would have to. So, for example, um, so I'm not an annihilationist when it comes to hell.
Mhm.
I don't think God. That is a view of that hell is a the eternal punishment is basically a capital punishment on your soul. God wipes you out of existence.
Mm.
Um, the reason I don't think God would do that because we bear His image, and that would be immoral of God to destroy something that bears His image. But a lot to say, God, by choosing to place His image on us, He has chosen to make us eternal in that sense. But animals having souls would not bear His image, and so they don't need to be sustained in existence. So, do animals go to heaven? If we're just thinking about souls, there's no reason to think that because a soul by nature isn't necessarily eternal. However, I think there are other reasons to say yes, animals will be in heaven. I think some scriptural basis for that. They're part of creation. God's going to restore our creation. We'll just leave that there. But note that just because a thing has a soul doesn't automatically mean it'll be eternal.
Got it. Okay. And souls. Yeah. I mean, you kind of talked about that where they go after death.
Who?
Human souls.
What the Bible would call paradise or the
Yeah.
intermediate state. Yeah.
Got it. Or hell, depending on like.
Some type of other intermediate state. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And then I really wanted to get into corpus callosum. That one's.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So this idea of like split brain patients, you split the thing connecting the two hemispheres of your brain, then they kind of act almost independently because they're not communicating with each other. How's the like soul connect with like the two different
So,
halves of the brain?
yeah, the corpus callosum, I think. Few things about this. So as you're saying, so here's an example of what you're saying. They sever the two hemispheres. They keep them from communicating. They sever it, but not just sever it. They sever it, and then they put certain. There's a test condition being conducted where they, because they can still communicate somehow. There's still something going on, but in this experiment they do, they keep the hemispheres from communicating, and then they like isolate somehow one hemisphere, and they ask the person, allowing them to only use one hemisphere, would you like to smoke? And they say yes. Then they change to the other hemisphere, would you like a smoke? They say no. And then you have this weird result of a person picking up a cigarette while the other hand slaps it out of the own person's hand.
Yeah.
And then you get like this. Should I go here? Sure. Then you get something similar when it comes to belief in God. Do you believe in God? Yes. You believe in God? No. And then atheists are like, oh, look, does half the soul go to hell? Half the soul go to heaven? Ha ha ha. Whatever. Very funny. So, what's going on? First and foremost, this only happens under these test conditions where they have to literally limit the communication of the hemispheres and whatnot. So, here's the first thing to take away: the person only acts in this kind of way under these conditions of the experiment, but then once they take all the things off the head and they put their jacket on and go home, they're perfectly fine. So there's something something different is happening in the experiment. That's the first thing to note. Two, it could be the case that, and I shared this with Moreland. He thought it was fair to think or say. He liked it. Put it this way: suppose I just told you a secret right now, but then as you're walking out, you slip and bang your head and you forgot the secret. Are you a different person?
No,
What has happened?
I forgot the secret.
Why? Because something in your brain was you were inhibited from accessing something in your brain.
Yeah.
But then let's say the pain wore off and then now you're good. You remember the secret again. You haven't changed persons. You just got a little brain damage or something has inhibited. Same thing happening, I'd say there. On top of that, imagine this. Imagine the left side of your brain, and I'm just throwing this out there as a possibility. I haven't verified anything, but something like this could be happening. Imagine the left side of your brain is associated with your doubts about God, and the right side of your brain is associated with the answers you have come to understand about those doubts.
Mm.
Well, guess what? If I limit and only talk to the left hemisphere, will only allow you to use the left hemisphere, what are you going to give me? Doubts you don't believe in God. But then if I allow you to access the other hemisphere, what are you going to give me? Oh, I have the answers to my doubts. But again, once I take them off, you can access the whole thing. You're perfectly fine. You're back to yourself. So I don't think the thing proves anything other than the fact that scientists can do some really weird stuff by limiting what the person can access, what hemisphere or parts of the brain a person can use.
Got it. And one thing, we're studying Leviticus, and in Leviticus it has this idea of like God's soul. Do you think that God has a soul?
I think he is a soul,
He is a soul. So
just like I am a soul.
got it. So in the way, in terms of like we are made in God's image, is the fact that we are a soul the same as God is? Is that what makes us in His image?
That might be one of the things, but I think it
Yeah.
has to do with more the it's an ontological thing of the kind of attributes we possess. So God is a soul with three minds.
Oh, I like that.
Me too.
Oh, that's interesting. I've been trying to think about the Trinity a little bit more recently. That's a really good one. Okay. Any final closing thoughts? Anything about the soul that we missed that you think's important?
There's always a lot more to say,
Yeah.
but no, I think where we took it to and what the questions you asked were really good. I think it's a good way to kind of introduce it. I talk in the book, The Lazy Approach. I talk more about consciousness and things like that of that nature. I contributed a chapter to a book that was written for Frank Turek in honor of him, and I wrote a chapter. I don't have enough faith to be a physicalist, kind of a play on his things. Um, and then if I'm not mistaken, I think I might be contributing another chapter to a book. I don't know the title that may be coming out next year on kind of AI on the soul. I was interviewed by my friend Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity, and we did like a whole 2 hours talking about AI and the soul and consciousness and stuff like that. So anybody curious there can go to my channel, Eric Hernandez, and just go check that out.
Yeah. All right. So guys, go check out his channel. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. It means so much to me. And if you really want to check out any of Eric's stuff, it'll be linked down below. His channel, of course, will be in this little circle thingy right around this area. And then also there's this episode right here, which is a great conversation about Christianity and other stuff like that. So go ahead and click that, and I will see you in the next episode.